First, welcome everybody to today's JRSA webinar. My name is Brad Brick. I'm a research associate with JRSA, and I'll be serving as the moderator today. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everyone is able to find and use the chat box on the right of your screen. It's on the right of my screen. It may be in a different place. It should be labeled chat. And we'll be using that to submit questions throughout the presentation today. As you type questions into the chat box, please make sure that you're sending it to all organizers and panelists only, so that we can see those and sort of keep track of those. Feel free to ask questions at any time during the presentation. I'll bring them up as needed, or if necessary, what we'll do is we'll save them until the end. So what I want everyone to do right now is to just sort of see if the chat works. Tell us where you're joining us from, and then also tell us if you've been able to visit the JRSA member page and create a profile. That profile allows people to participate in our community forums that we have and online discussion boards that we hold over there. So please, if you take a second right now, tell us where you're joining us from and whether or not you've been able to go to that JRSA member page. If not today, at least at some point in time in the past. We will be posting information about how to access the JRSA member page, probably when we email out the synopsis and the recording of today's session. So today's session is going to be recording. While it's scheduled for an hour, if we have a lot of questions at the end, we can go over a little bit. If you have to leave right at 1 o'clock, please feel free to do so, and we'll get the link to the recording so you can see what the discussion at the end covered on your own time. And finally, at the end of the presentation, we will be sharing a link to a quick feedback survey. We ask you all to please take that survey. We really, really, really value that information that you provide. And it's also where you'll be able to request a copy of the slides. So with that, let me go ahead and welcome everyone back again. And so today's webinar is entitled Qualitative Methods for Social Research, as you can see on the title slide today. And joining us is Henry Brownstein from from West Virginia University, and I'll get a little bit more into his background in just a second. So Mark, if you could advance the slides for me. So as part of the registration for this webinar, we asked what word or phrase comes to mind when you think about qualitative research, and we got a lot of insightful answers. On the screen right now, you can see some of those most common answers that we got that we've put into a word cloud. But there were other answers that didn't fit nicely into this word cloud. And some of those things that we heard was that qualitative research can be messy, that it can be fun, that it's not as rigorous as quantitative research. And also that it helps us to explore concepts a little bit deeper, that it adds a human element to enhance quantitative studies, and many, many more comments along those lines. So clearly, this is a topic of interest for all of us who are here today. And it's a topic of interest for our members at JRSA and those folks who are working at SACS. Next slide, Mark. So this is just the first of 2 sessions, both of which Dr. Brownstein has so kindly agreed to present and help us out with. So today, let me go ahead and welcome Dr. Brownstein, who's going to guide us through our topic today. Dr. Henry Brownstein is a distinguished professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Eberly College of Arts and Sciences at West Virginia University. During his extensive career, Dr. Brownstein has served as an associate dean for research at the Wilder School at Virginia Commonwealth, a senior vice president and a senior fellow at Newark, director of the Center on Crime and Drugs and Justice at Apt Associates, director of the Drugs and Crime Division at NIJ, professor and director of the graduate program in criminal justice at the University of Baltimore, and associate professor at Russell Sage College. Dr. Brownstein also has extensive experience working in state governments, as he spent 13 years with the New York SAC as a principal researcher, the SAC director, and the chief of statistical services for the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. Over his career, he has been awarded almost $10 million in grants as either a principal or co-principal investigator. He's the author of 5 books and the editor or co-editor of 2 more on drugs and society, drug markets, drug policy, and crime and violence. He's authored or co-authored more than 60 journal articles, book chapters, government reports, essays, and op-ed articles. He was awarded his PhD in sociology from Temple University in 1977. He is the recipient of the Senior Scholar Award for 2017 from the American Sociological Association section on alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. So, as you can see, he is an extremely esteemed guest with lots of experience doing drugs and crime research and qualitative research. And I think we can all look forward to what we're going to learn here this week and next. And remember, next week, please join us for the session 2, using qualitative methods to inform criminal justice policy and practice. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brownstein.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate that. And sounds like my whole CV there. Welcome, and thank you for having me here today. I did review some of the responses that you saw in that word cloud, and that's a lot of stuff. I mean, I'm going to try to tell you what I can, but you have a lot of different interests, and that's not surprising. You know, you've worked in different settings, you have done a lot of different kinds of research, you have varying degrees of interest in qualitative analysis and qualitative research. You've expressed some thoughts about your confidence in doing research, in qualitative research, and how you might be able to communicate findings and so on. And there's a lot of different things. So I'm gonna give you as much as I can in a day. To address everything that was on that list, we would need several weeks. But I just want to make some very important points about qualitative work and give you some background about what I've done before I actually get started, because there's no simple way to do qualitative research. There's no blueprint. If you're doing quantitative research and you want to do an experiment, you have to do certain things for it to be an experiment. If you don't, it might be a quasi-experiment, but even there are certain things you must do for it to be considered a quasi-experiment. Forget about randomized control trials, because it's very difficult to meet the requirements of a randomized control trial. And every article that I read has limitations at the end. And that's all okay. There's nothing wrong with that. All I'm saying is that there are guidelines for doing quantitative work. For qualitative work, there aren't. You're going out into the world. You're going out among other people, and you have to understand those people from their perspective. Every time you go out in the field to do qualitative research, you have to be creative. You have to change things as you're going. It's not the kind of thing where you can say step 1, step 2, step 3. It's where do these people lead you? You start up with a research question. You've had a theory. The theory informs the question. The research guides you into this community to find out what is the answer to those questions that you have from the perspective of the people who are in those communities. The result is that in qualitative research, everybody who does it has different knowledge, and it's true of everything. People have different knowledge, different values, different opinions, different ideas about what makes a qualitative study, different ideas about when it's appropriate to use a qualitative study, and they have different education and different experience. And it's really the education and experience that informs the work that you do. And in qualitative research, that's really important. So I want to tell you a little bit about my experience with qualitative work and my education with qualitative work. I've been doing this kind of work for 50 years. And thank you for the slide. And I've been doing qualitative research for 50 years now, going back to when I was an undergraduate and a master's student. In fact, when I got my master's degree in the early 70s, I was required to take 2 courses in theory and 2 courses in methods, one quantitative, one qualitative. They did not offer statistics. That's how I saw sociology. When I went for my PhD and people asked me what I did, and I told them, they said, that's not sociology. It was becoming more and more statistical. That was the early 70s into the late 70s. Things were changing at that time. So I was always interested in qualitative work, and my work experience has been in a lot of different settings. I started out at a college. I was teaching and doing a little bit of research, but there was not a lot of infrastructure or support for research where I was. And I was interested in learning more about what was going on with the quantitative world, because I figured if that's where sociology is, I should find out what's going on. And that's when I took the job at New York State. And I worked there, as Brad said, over 13 years. And it was, at the end, I was the chief of statistical services. Not statistical analysis, statistical services, which is different. And I learned a lot, and I came to appreciate what could be done with statistics and what could not be done with statistics, what could be done with quantitative research, what could not be done with quantitative research, and also qualitative. Because I stayed a qualitative researcher. A lot of the work I did, even there, turned out to be qualitative. And the work that you do anywhere really depends on what the issues are, what the concerns are. So a lot of the work I did followed the issues of the day, essentially, for what was going on in the 80s and 90s with crack cocaine, with violence, with crime rates, with incarceration, and so on. So I'm going to be talking today about what I've learned over these years and through these different experiences, and giving you examples of what I've done. I want to start out by saying something about what I believe social research is. And I have some citations on here because these aren't things that I made up. New knowledge by drawing upon past knowledge was something I read in an article that Robert Merton wrote years ago. And if you think about it, that's really what we're doing. We start out by going through the available literature to see what's been done already, what people have learned, what questions are still out there. And that helps guide us towards the kind of work that we need to be doing. It also enables us, research, generally social research, to conceptualize and analyze our experience of social life as presented as an empirical reality. So there are a lot of different things that people do, that people say, and what we're doing is trying to understand all of that and understand it as a dialogue between ideas and evidence. Next slide, please. Why social research? Why do we do it? Well, I'll say when I was an undergraduate, I started reading C. Wright Mills and the Sociological Imagination, Peter Berger, Invitation to Sociology, books like that. I began to think, if I really want to understand the social world, if I want to understand social experience, I need to see it through the eyes of everyone who ever lived. Of course, you can only say that when you're in college. Once you graduate, you shouldn't be saying things like that anymore. So I became interested in social order and trying to understand social order from the perspective of people who I could reach. Not everyone, obviously, but people I could reach. So it became qualitative research made a lot of sense to me, even at that time. Then, as I said, when I went to get on my master's and continued on at Brooklyn College, and I worked, and I took a class specifically in qualitative methods with Alfred McClung Lee, he convinced me that using participant observation would be a very valuable way to do what I was hoping to be able to do on a realistic scale. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to go back again quickly through a little discussion of the evolution of research over the last 100 years, the evolution of social research. And if you think back to the early 20th century, the classical ethnographies that we've done, particularly at the University of Chicago, excuse me, were highly regarded and continue to be highly regarded, so that qualitative approaches were given recognition and respect, and something that changed in the middle of the 20th century when we started to see technology changing and we went from mainframes to personal computers. We began to see massive amounts of data, statistical programs, SPSS, SAS, computers all over the world were linked, internet, the web, the cloud, all of that changed everything. And suddenly it was possible to take data that had been recorded for other purposes and use it to do research. And it became very appealing to people to do that kind of work. By the later part of the century and into the 21st century, people started to do multi-methods because they realized you can't answer every question the same way. And mixed methods really are not exactly the same as multi-methods because they really do more to integrate the methods, whereas multi-methods sort of just pile them one on the other. The next slide, please. Okay, so again, doing social research involves conceptualizing, describing, analyzing, understanding, and explaining social experience. And there are different methods that need to be used depending on what your concern is, what your question is. One thing is the subject of interest. What is it you're trying to learn about makes a difference in terms of what kind of data you need to have, what kind of information you have, and where you can find it. Also, the questions you're asking. If you're asking questions about the extent to which something is happening or whether or not something is changing over time, you may want to do quantitative work because it makes more sense. If you want to see if crime is going up or down, you have to see how many crimes took place in different periods of time in different places to be able to do comparison. But it also depends on how you define social reality. And you may, as Durkheim told us, society is made up of social facts. Social facts are things. So it's a very objective approach. You're looking for those things. Crime is something. And you know what it is, and you're going to go out there and you're going to count it. You're going to measure it, you're going to count it. Or you may follow Weber and look at society in terms of social action, which is much more subjective, because now you're talking about the things people do, leading eventually to the idea of the social construction of reality, that society is what people do. It's the way people act that makes society. Next slide, please. Okay, poll question. Okay. 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 So we got some things to clear up here. Okay, can we get the next slide? Okay, so the different methods of social research, and obviously the sharpest contrast is between quantitative and qualitative methods. And quantitative methods really are about measure. They're really about identifying something that you see as an object that needs to be counted, that needs to be measured. And it could be, so if you're looking at crime, for example, you would go and look at how crime is counted, and you look at the UCR, you look at NIBRs, and all these things are improvements over the other as you go forward. But at the same time, the question is, what did you measure? Why did you measure it? Was it worth measuring? Whatever it is, that's a very important part of the process that doesn't get, I believe, the attention that it deserves. So you end up, when we talk about crime, we're really talking about crimes known to the police. When we talk about victimization, we're talking about something that was collected from a survey. When we talk about looking at the relationship between them, we're doing a statistical analysis of those things that we measured and counted that may or not reflect what we're really interested in. Qualitative research, you're looking for commonalities rather than relationships among variables, and the emphasis is really on meaning. So the question becomes, and even if you're doing a survey or you're doing an analysis of record data, you really want to stop and ask yourself, what is it? What's the meaning of what you're counting? So if you're counting crimes from UCR, that's tricky. When I worked for New York State, for example, we had issues with trying to understand. Well, I was responsible when I was SNAC director for the UCR program. So we would get the data from 800 police departments around the state. We would take that data and we would try to count how many crimes there were in different counties, how many crimes there were in different years and so on. But what we were counting was what was reported to us by the 800 departments. I'll take it back, they had a null report. The ones that did, we didn't really know what they were doing because we were not out there controlling it in any way. We didn't have any field services to go and help them. They were just sending us what they sent it, and they sent it in the aggregate. So it's very difficult for us to know what we're really working with. Mixed methods really are trying to integrate it and say, when you're doing any research, you really have to look at all different sides of it, and different sides of it require different methods. So if you're looking at, for example, if you're trying to do a study of crime, on the one side, on the qualitative side, you need to be considering, what do we mean by crime? And what are we measuring as crime? Then if you're looking at the quantitative side, you accept that measure and you work with it and do statistical analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, so comparing qualitative methods and quantitative methods. Conceptually, there are differences in terms of whether or not you're looking at the world, social experience as an objective reality, which calls for a deductive kinds of approach to eliminate plausible explanations, or if you're doing qualitative work, you're looking at social phenomena as subjects, and you're emphasizing meaning. You're looking for meaning in the symbolic representations, and it's more of an inductive approach. Methodologically, quantitative methods are helping you to identify the relationships or to study the relationships between discrete and precisely defined and measured variables. And that's important, precisely defined and measured. You have to know what you're talking about. Qualitative methods are designed for the study of commonalities among broadly conceptualized phenomenon, social phenomenon, and there you're really trying to understand what they mean without even getting into counting them or measuring them. Next slide, please. A lot of qualitative work has often been built into the idea of grounded theory, which refers to systematic inductive methods for conducting qualitative work aimed towards theory development. So you're really beginning, you have an idea, you have some conceptual idea of what you're thinking about, and you really are collecting information from people to understand what it is that's happening in that area or in that place or at that time. Next slide, please. Another poll question. Okay, giving voice, good. I don't know how you would, okay. I don't know how you would predict with qualitative analysis, but okay. So the next slide. Okay, the general goals of research. And this is not just qualitative research, this is really all research. And yes, it's important to identify patterns of relations, testing and refining theories. Making predictions is not something that you would really do. It's something you would really be doing a statistical analysis for. Giving voice is something that's really very powerful with qualitative methods. Next slide, please. The particular goals and objectives of qualitative research. The first thing you're doing is you're immersing yourself in a research setting. So you can pretend to know what's in that setting before you get there. You really have to have some framework for thinking about why you're going there. Why did you pick this place? Why are you talking to these people? Why are you interviewing these people? Why are you watching what they're doing here? What do you expect to learn from this? You probe, you analyze, you interpret in the natural setting. So you're enhancing rather than condensing. And if you think about what you're doing in quantitative work, you're condensing data. You're bringing it all down to a single objective item that you are measuring and then counting. When you are doing qualitative work, you're not breaking it down that way. You're thinking about it in terms of what it means. And it means whatever the people you're talking to say it means. And it's up to you to understand what it means from their perspective. You're trying to understand. So I'll go into more examples of that later, but you're trying to understand what people are saying. You're advancing theoretical thinking through grounded theory. You're giving voice to marginalized social groups. And that's something really important, because sometimes you're getting to people. A lot of qualitative work has been done in the drug world, because drug users and drug dealers tend to be hidden populations. There are no records. You can't count what they're doing. You have to, if you're going to understand what they're doing or why they're doing it, you have to get to them. And it's not always easy. When I was at NIJ, we had a program called Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring. So some of you may remember Adam. It was a nice program for a while, and then it went away. But it was in 35 counties around the country. Data were collected from arrestees within 48 hours of arrest. They were given a 20-minute interview, and a urine sample was collected and analyzed. And 35,000 inmates, or rather arrestees per year, were involved. These were people who were being selected for this particular program, and it was NIJ was spending $26 million every 3 years on this program. So it was a serious program. They were being selected because there wasn't an easy way to find people who were known or likely to be drug users. Once it was realized that arrestees, people who get arrested, have a better chance of being involved with illicit drugs than the general population, the sampling was done within that population. So they were given voice that they wouldn't have been given otherwise. The next slide. Okay, the data collection. And I want to talk a little bit about the different approaches that are used. And the methods of data collection in qualitative analysis are used to construct meaningful description and interpretations of the research subject and the subject that you're interested in studying. And ethnography, participant observation, studies that have been around for a long time. With an ethnography, you're either overtly or covertly sticking your nose in people's lives for an extended period of time and watching what happens, listening to what they say, asking them questions, collecting any information you can get from them. A good example of an ethnography, there were a lot of good examples of ethnography, but one that came to mind when I was thinking about this was the work that Sudhir Venkatesh did in Chicago when he was working on his dissertation. He ended up writing a book, Gang Leader for a Day, Rogue Sociologist Takes to the Streets. And he spent 3 years hanging out in Robert Taylor projects in Chicago. And it was an area with high crime, high drug use, high levels of violence. And he went in there and he got to know somebody, a guy named JT, who was a leader of a drug dealing gang. And he became close and he worked with him for 3 years. And the problem is people started complaining about what he's doing because, and this happens with ethnography all the time, people are arguing that in fact, you get into a situation where it's hard to separate theory from morality. It's hard to understand at what point you are protecting this person or defending this person or standing up for this person as opposed to analyzing what they're doing. And it's really hard sometimes because you have to keep their trust. I mean, one of the most important things in qualitative work, if there's one thing you take away today, the most important thing in qualitative work is respect. You cannot talk to somebody if you do not show them respect. They won't tell you anything. And that doesn't mean I have to respect you because you killed somebody. You know, when I went into a prison, I talked to somebody who committed homicide. I didn't respect the fact that they killed somebody, but as a human being, I had to show them respect. I had to show them that I was not judging them. So that's the key to doing good qualitative work, is to make sure that when you're in the community, when you're talking to people, you're not talking down to them. You're not condescending. You're not making them feel like there's something wrong with them and you're there to judge them. So anyway, so going back to what I was talking about, the idea that you go into a community, you like spend the time there. One of the studies that I had done early on with a colleague of mine, I was working with an organization called NDRI, Narcotic Drug Research, incorporated back when I worked for New York State, and crack was the issue. It was so serious that in 1990, the governor of New York, Governor Mario Cuomo, gave the state of the state message and said there are three problems that New York has: drugs, drugs, and drugs. That's how bad it was. So I was working for New York. I was doing research. It was before I became the SAC director. I was doing research for New York, and the interest in drugs was so serious that they sort of loaned me out to NDRI to work on research that they had been doing, and we spent the next 15 years working with them, even though I was a New York State employee. I would be written to proposals at a percent of my time, and then the state would donate that time. But I worked on this proposal. So one of the early studies we did, and I'll talk more about some of these studies later, but one of the studies we did, we went into prisons to interview people who had been sentenced for homicide in 1984. And because I worked for New York State, the governor spoke to the commissioner of corrections who worked for him, and he spoke to the superintendents of the prisons, and we were able to get into the prisons. Of course, each superintendent had to give us particular permission to get into that prison. So it was quite a process. But when we got in, we were talking about how we were going to do this. And we were going to be doing interviews in a number of prisons around the state of New York, including Attica, Sing Sing, Dannemora. You know a lot of the names probably. And before we could go in, my colleague spoke to the person who we were working with in Department of Corrections and said, before we start the interviews, we'd like to just sort of hang around in the prison and talk to people, let them get to know us and so on, rap with them. This was the 90s. And, and they looked at us like, you people are crazy. You can't do that kind of ethnographic work. You can't just walk into prison and wander around and expect people not to treat you in some weird way. So we never did that, but we did the interviews and they went very well. And I'll talk more about those later. Well, actually, semi-structured interviewing is the other method I want to talk about besides ethnography. Semi-structured, open-ended, in-depth interviews, either at the individual or the group level. And at the individual level, you're really talking to people and trying to understand from them what it is that their experience was like. So we did a lot of studies in the prisons, but also in youth facilities and on the streets. And we spoke to people about different kinds of things that were important in terms of their experience of having ultimately killed someone, because they were sitting in prison. We went in around 1989, and we were into the first study. We interviewed people who had been arrested for homicide in 1984, went through the system, and when they came out of the other end, they were sitting in prison now. And in those days, if you remember, the prisons were overcrowded. Those were the days when everybody was talking about overcrowding. And not to say they're not now, but that was an early point where people really were taking it very seriously. And there was some concern about, we're going to go into the prison, we're going to cite these people. But because the people who were in the prisons were willing to talk to us, because most of them had been sentenced for murder, but they were rather charged with murder, but sentenced for manslaughter, and they were serving 5 to 15. We come in about 4 years after they start the sentence, so they're getting out pretty soon anyway, and good, as long as they don't get into trouble, and because they wanted to empty the prisons as much as they could, but also because it had been going on for, this happened so many years ago, there was no reason they didn't have to tell us. I want to talk a little bit about how truthful they were in terms of whether or not we should have believed what they told us. But if you think about it, because they already had been sentenced, what they're going to tell us is going to be a story. And it's a very interesting thing because the story was something that they had been telling over and over again from the time the event happened. The event happened, there were certain things that really happened. They were aware of those, they were part of it, and then they got arrested. And they have to tell the police what it is that they did. Then they have to tell their lawyer. Then they go to court and they have to tell it in front of the court to the judge and to the jury, if there was a jury. And if they didn't have a plea, or if they had a plea, the story ended with the lawyer. Then they go to the corrections and they have to tell the story all over again. It gets written down, there's a record of it. And then this is 4 years later, and we come in and we want to hear the story. The story becomes the narrative that they created. And it was interesting because most of them wanted us to think that, hey, I'm a decent person. I remember sitting in Sing Sing with someone who was in special housing, and he was happy to talk to me because he got out an extra 45 minutes they gave him for the interview. And we talked, and We asked them about life history. We asked them about the experience of that day or night. And this guy was telling me a story about how he and his friend were drinking all day, and they went out at night and they're getting high, they're using heroin. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning and they're closing the bar, and they walk outside and they see somebody urinating on his friend's car. Well, what would you do? And he asked me with a straight face, what would you do if you saw somebody? He shot him and killed him. I wouldn't have done that, but I'm not going to say it. As an interviewer, you have to keep the sense of not so much objectivity, but as respect. I'm not going to say it was good or bad what you did. That's not my point. My point is just to hear what you have to say about what you did, why you did it, and how you feel about it. And I'm not going to ask you anything else about anything you're planning to do, because then we have to stop the interview. You can't tell me about future crimes or you get us both in trouble. Okay, so there are other innovations that are coming around now for data collection. Rapid qualitative analysis, when you're doing a quick study, participatory action research, where you make the researchers, the participants, researchers as part of your team, and so on. And all those things are going on. And the truth is, if you really want to be able to do these things, you have to go out and start reading about them and seeing what other people have done, and figure out what's going to work for you. Okay, can you go on to the next slide? Trying to keep an eye on the time. Sampling for qualitative research. So as I was talking before, a lot of it is done with hidden populations because there's no other way to get to these people. But sometimes it's just because before you go out and start counting things, start measuring things, you want to make sure that you know what you should be looking at, what you should be asking for. You may start with a theory, and then that theory takes you to a certain area, to a certain social setting, certain social situation, certain social relationships, and you're then trying to understand and give meaning to what's going on from the perspective of the people who live it, so that it is real. It's not just, that's, like people who commit a crime and think it's not really a crime. Everybody does it. You want to know when people understand that they're committing a crime and recognize it, and why they're doing it and how it fits into their life. Anyway, so the problem with these kinds of, with collecting or identifying and selecting respondents for this kind of work, is that you often don't have any records to work with. So, if you want to go out and do a study of, well, for example, say you want to study people who have committed a crime, you don't know who they all are, but you can study arrestees. If you want to study drug users, there is not a list somewhere. It's not like the phone book and you can say, well, we're going to select a random sample of these people who use cocaine, or people who use heroin, or whatever it is. You have to go to somewhere where there's a high level of use, like I was saying with Adam, and get involved with asking people in that area to talk to you. Well, you can't just walk up on the street and say to somebody, excuse me, I'm doing this interview, can I talk to you about your heroin use? It doesn't work like that. When I was doing a study of methamphetamine markets, for example, we would ask people to tell us, one of the questions we asked is, if we traveled all over the country and we spoke to people in 5 different regions, and I'll talk more about that later. But when we got out there, we'd talk to the police, we'd talk to drug dealers, drug users, treatment people, family service providers, anybody else, even taxi drivers. And we'd ask everybody the same question. We asked a lot of things, but one of the questions we asked was, if I wanted to buy methamphetamine, where would I go in your community? And the answer was always the same: you can't. You can only buy methamphetamine from somebody you know, which was interesting because we learned something that way. But also we tried that with some cab drivers once. We had to stop because they would pull over to the curb and get ready to kick us out of the cab. And we'd have to explain that we're doing research. We're not actually looking to buy methamphetamine. But the point is that your sampling is very tricky. So snowball sampling is what it used to be called. It still is really. Or convenience sampling is selecting people who are just there because they're there. Before Adam, there was DUF, drug use forecasting, which selected a convenience sample of people. People who got arrested, as they walked in, they'd stop them, ask them, and whoever would talk to you would talk to you. Later on, they went to a more scientific approach, which became Adam. But the point is, with snowball sampling, it's a technique that usually involves key informants where you get to know people and they introduce you to other people. Today there's a respondent-driven sampling, which is more mathematical and it's not really a qualitative approach, but it's a way to select a sample. Snowball sampling is just straightforward convenience. Whoever will talk to you will talk to you, and key informants are very helpful. The idea of how many people you should talk to really depends. It's not like where you draw a random sample and you can mathematically determine how representative they are of all of the people you're trying to reach. Rather, you use theoretical saturation, where you're constantly comparing. And what's happening is you're collecting data, you're talking to people. It's an iterative process, and you're adding more and more respondents. And each time you're asking the same general questions, you're hearing different stories from people, and you'll reach a point where you're not learning anything new. And that's theoretical saturation. It's a problem because it's very subjective. You have to decide, well, that's it. I mean, everybody, the last 10 people I spoke to told me the same thing. I'm not getting any new information. It doesn't pay to go any further. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, data analysis, analytic induction. Analytic induction. When you're focusing on cases representing broad social phenomenon and systematically analyzing commonalities, so you can get a deeper understanding. It's not necessarily deductive, but it's not deductive. It's mostly an inductive approach. When you're building from what they tell you, you're building the theory, you're building the explanation, you're building your understanding. And you need to consider the theory that you bring into it from the perspective of subjective adequacy. In other words, is what you say equivalent to, or at least similar to, what those people who live that say? I can come in and tell them, well, here's the way I think of what's going on in your neighborhood, and they can tell you, you got it all wrong. And that's what you really want from a qualitative study. Well, what is right? What's going on here? Before you can, and if you're going to use it as exploratory for quantitative work, you really got to get the meaning straight so you know what you need to count and measure later on. But when we did the methamphetamine study, for example, it was a study where we started with a survey of police departments, 1,400 police departments out of the 18,000 or so in the country. And we wanted to find out where methamphetamine was considered an issue. And then we did 50 phone calls with narcotics detectives in selected communities based on the survey that we had done. We used the quantitative as our exploratory piece. We selected 50 places, and we did a WebEx connection with these narcotics detectives. And we had someone on our team go to the DEA's data, seizure data, and create maps of those communities that we're going to and identify where seizures had taken place over a 5-year period with different color balloons. And when you put the cursor over the balloon, it will give you an address. And we'd set this up during the interview with the detective, and we'd go through the map and talk about it. And when you hit a dot and show them a date, they would tell you the whole story about what happened that night. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that we didn't expect to get. It added to our knowledge because they told us things about stuff we didn't really understand. Things like, I never had heard of smurfing before then. Wouldn't have imagined what it was. But if you remember, part of our study was funded because we were looking at what were the consequences, the unintended consequences of the legislation at the federal and state level that put cough medicine behind the counter. You could only get 2 at a time. You couldn't order any more than that. So you needed more pseudoephedrine in the cough medicine to make methamphetamine. It was supposed to stop people from making meth. But I could get 2. I get 10 people. They could each get 2. I am a good cook. You come to my house and I cook it up, and we'll have a nice party. We'll get high together. The cartel. We learned later by taking that information that the cartels were doing the same thing on a larger scale. They were coming in through Mexico into the Southwest, and they were getting vans and recruiting homeless people, putting them in the vans and giving them fake IDs and taking them to pharmacies. And they would collect enough for a super lab so that they could make larger quantities than just enough for a small social event or small group of people to get together. I also was recently involved in another study there was legislation in West Virginia that was trying to change the way doctors prescribed opioids, limiting them, and had all sorts of regulations. And we had looked at some of the data on that, but we also did open-ended surveys, semi-structured open-ended surveys with doctors in the state who had prescribed for their patients opioids. And what we learned was something we didn't expect: the amount of fear that they felt that if they prescribed to people who needed opioids, and a lot of the patients did, they would get in trouble. So we eventually wrote an article called "The DEA Will Get You," because it was something that we hadn't expected, but it came to be something that was fairly interesting. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, another approach, aside from analytic induction, is narrative analysis. And if you are looking at the world today, you know how important narratives are. Narratives can beat out facts any day, and that's what's happening. And you see that here. So you really want to get a sense of the narrative that these people have about their work. It's not necessarily the truth of it, but it's the way they interpret their world. And you want to know that when you're doing qualitative work. It's helpful to know that. You learn from different people about the meaning that they give to the experience in ways that you couldn't know it without going directly to them. And you can analyze these narratives by theme or by how a respondent tells a story, their interactions, so on. Okay, let's go to the next question. Next slide, rather. Okay, software. There are a lot of programs out there you can use to analyze qualitative data, and I don't use any of them because basically they're giving you an account of how many times a particular word is spoken, particular phrase is spoken, or how many patterns they can find in a certain thing, and it's a count. It's unfortunately they're counting, and by definition, that's not qualitative analysis. I think it's more important to actually take the data and live with it. Once the interviews are done, once the ethnographic data are collected, when you're doing an ethnography, you're keeping a daily record of everything that you learn, and you have to go back to that. You have to get other people to go back with you, and you're looking for meaning. You're not looking for measure, not looking for how many times people said something. You're looking for the narrative, the analysis of what people said, what they did, what's the meaning that they're giving to it. So there are no shortcuts. Next slide. Okay, validity, and this is important. I do want to say, by the way, about narrative analysis, when we did the prison studies, so you can leave it where it is, Mark, but I'm going to go back a minute. When we did the prison studies, we would sit down for an hour in a prison with hundreds of people, all the interviews we sent out, and we'd sit and we'd talk to the folks, and they were telling you their story, and the ones that would sit with us, and the ones we could find. Sometimes we'd go into a prison and we'd get the list of names that corrections told us would be there, and they can't find some of them. So that's something else. But when we sat down with somebody and they're telling us the story, as I said before, it's a narrative that they're telling that they now believe. Is it the truth of what actually happened? Who knows? But it is what they believe happened. And that's what we're trying to understand, how they came to this point and how that was relevant to who they think they are today and who they can be after this. And also relevant to our understanding of why people do these kinds of things. What are the circumstances? What are the experiences? Okay. So now, getting back to validity. Validity broadly is the closest of agreement of a test with some independently observed criterion of the behavior under consideration, right? But it also could be considered trustworthiness relative to credibility, transferability, dependability, confirmability. Overall, it's the relationship between an account and something outside of that account. So how do you apply this to qualitative work? You don't have any objective criteria in qualitative work, because if you're doing qualitative work, you have to accept that social reality has a subjective side, if it is not completely subjective. It's not necessarily something that's out there, it's something that people make happen. You can say that there's something called education, and schools exist, and teachers exist. Yes, that's true, but if you talk to teachers, every one of them is different. If you talk to students, they're all different. Schools are all different. You know, they only exist in the way people live them. And that's what qualitative work is trying to get at, understanding the lives of people, the experiences of people, the relationships of people as they see it, as they experience it, because they've constructed it. It's something that comes out of their experience with other people. Okay, so when you look at, when you consider validity generally, it's really, if you're going to do qualitative work, you have to recognize that you're dealing with a subjective subject, you're dealing with a subjective phenomenon, and trustworthiness is different than it would be if you're doing an objective analysis. It's not the same. You can't say, well, you know, I can't stand back and say, you know, well, I don't know. This is just crime is crime. I have nothing to do with it. It's no, crime is what these people do and what they experience. And you want to be able to understand it in terms of whether or not what they're telling you is trustworthy and credible. Does it make sense? Is it dependable, confirmable, transferable? Okay, next slide. And as I was saying, in quantitative work, you are establishing measures that are objectively conceived and clearly defined criterion. And you consider about different kinds of validity, internal validity, external validity. Is what you're measuring actually what you think you're measuring? Is this something that can be generalized? But what you come up with is a mathematical probability, which is not qualitative. The next slide, please. Okay, so meaning, being a subjective phenomenon, the decision to accept correspondence of meanings requires an appreciation of the relative certainty that the subjective interpretations are knowable and coherent. So even though they are subjective, can you know what this person is talking about? Does it make sense to you? And you look for what Weber called adequacy with respect to meaning. How will the conceptual construction of a social phenomenon by a researcher can be recognized and understood by the social actors who participate in the phenomenon in real life experience? I want to give a couple of examples. When I worked for New York, when I started working in New York, I was brought into the research unit. It was the early 80s. And the big issue, and again, you know, issues are whatever people say they are. Again, it's subjective. The big issue of the time was alternatives to incarceration because of the overcrowding in prisons. Everybody wanted to find alternatives. So I was brought in and I was leading an evaluation team at the time. And we ended up doing 2 studies of alternatives to incarceration. One was a study of a felony program where it was funded in a small county. The state, and the reason we were able to do this was because the state had given them money. So in this county in central New York, they had a program called client-specific planning. And the idea was when somebody is convicted, the probation department produces a report, a probation report. Gives you a lot of background and who this person is and what you need to know before you sentence the person. Client-specific planning said that's a prosecution side report. They would write a defense side report. And they would get people in the community to say, this is a great guy. He may have beat the hell out of somebody, but hey, you know, he means well. It was a fair fight, so on and so on, whatever it is. He has a job lined up. We're going to get him into school. He has a place to live, or she, and all of this, right? That was a comparison of the two. So what we did was we collected this data from the county about, you know, who was processed by this program, and it wasn't very many people. And we also spoke to judges and we spoke to police officers and probation officers in the county. And what we learned was that well, we used what's called a Delphi, based on the Delphi technique that Rand had developed. And so we were looking for feedback based on, so in those cases, we wrote a group report. We sent it out to the people who we had interviewed and asked them, is this what you told us? Is this what's happening here? And what we learned was that when a judge is about to sentence somebody and they've already been convicted and probation has already done a report, they're not interested in a second report, or they weren't at the time. They were not going to accept. So this person, the probation department is saying they should get sentenced to 2 years in prison, and you're saying, no, give them probation and they'll be fine. It doesn't work that way. And we wrote an evaluation of that. We also did a second one on a misdemeanor program in another county on Long Island, that I shouldn't have said that because only 2 counties on Long Island, but it was a county where they had a jail program. That was the felony was a prison program. This was a jail program, and they really they had a different kind of program where they work with people, and getting people out of jail is a lot easier than getting them out of prison because this crimes are not as serious. They're not going to serve as much time. But it was the same kind of thing. But what we did was listed items based on the responses and let them respond to the items. So we tried to get some feedback to use that for validity. In the methamphetamine study, there was an interesting story. I'm running out of time, so I'll just real quickly tell it. We were out on the West Coast somewhere, and we were talking. It was 3 of us who were on our research team. We went out to the West Coast. We went to this small city police department, and we were sitting with the police chief, his deputy, somebody from a local hospital who worked with people who had drug overdoses and drug addiction. We have somebody from the local newspaper who was a reporter and told stories about drugs, and I forget and a social worker. And we're talking. And at that point, what we were doing for the purpose of validity was we would give a little narrative about what we thought we had learned, because we had traveled all across the country at that point. So we said, here's what we think is going on. And we explained to them how the markets work and so on. And after we finished, the chief looked at his deputy and said, go check their car. And everybody in the room laughed because it was really stupid. But the fact is, clearly, what we had said held true with him. He seemed to have some, or at least some recognition that, oh, you guys know some stuff. So it was not a real measure of validity like you would get in a quantitative study. And that's one of the things somebody had a comment about. It's not as rigorous. It is rigorous, but in a different way. You cannot ignore these things. You cannot ignore validity, but you're not going to count validity. You're not going to have a number that says it's valid. You're going to have to get some kind of assessment from people about whether or not what you're saying is a reflection of what their experience has been. Okay, I have a lot more to say, but if you're going to be back next week, I'll be talking more about how we can use this to convince and to inform policymakers and practitioners, but also convince them that it actually is worth doing. So if there are any questions, I'm ready to answer or try. No questions?
Thanks, Dr. Brownstein. If you do have questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat box. Otherwise, at this time, we should have a little link in the chat box for the feedback poll. I would ask everyone in the audience to please click on that and provide your feedback to today's session. Again, this is important information that JRSA takes seriously to help plan and organize upcoming webinars in the future. And again, if there are any questions, please drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we have about 1 minute left, and I just want to thank everyone for showing up. We are meeting again next week, same time, same day, Tuesday. Next Tuesday at 1 p.m. We'll be doing part 2 of this. So please bring questions to that if they didn't get answered today, and we can always ask those next week as well. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to assume that we're going to hold questions until next week, and that if they do come in, please, we'll take care of those as they come in as well. Otherwise, please join me in thanking Dr. Brownstein for taking his time today, and we will do this all again in 1 week. So thank you again, and everyone have a great day. We'll leave the feedback poll open for a couple of minutes if you need a couple of minutes, but otherwise we're finished for our webinar today.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.